My name is Megan Norris. I'm 33 years old. 2 Saturdays ago, my sister stood up at her own wedding reception, tapped a fork against a champagne glass, and told 200 people I'd been fired. She said it with a warm, sorry-for-you smile. She said, "Megan doesn't work at the firm anymore. They let her go last month." Very quietly, very sad. Then she raised her glass like she'd just said something kind. I was standing by the gift table with a glass of water I hadn't touched. I did not respond. I just watched her face because I already knew something she didn't, and I wanted to see her enjoy the last 5 minutes of not knowing it. That part comes later. Let me back up because you need to understand where I come from before you understand why I stayed so quiet for so long. I grew up in Bend, Oregon, in a family that ran its own wealth management firm. My father, Dennis, is the principal. My mother, Paula, works the front desk a few days a week, greeting clients like they're old friends, because most of them are. My older sister, Heather, is 3 years ahead of me, and from the time she was a teenager, she was groomed to be the face of that firm, warm, photogenic, the one who remembered everybody's grandchildren's names. I was the other one, the quiet one. Good with numbers, which in my family was treated like a personality quirk, not a skill. Nobody ever said it out loud, but I understood early that Heather was the daughter they built the business around, and I was the daughter who happened to also work there. If you grew up as the overlooked one in a family that only had room for one golden child, go ahead and hit like on this video right now and subscribe, because you are going to want to see what happens to mine. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are tonight, because I have a feeling some of you are up later than you should be, and I'd like to know I'm not the only one. The one person in that family who ever really saw me was my grandmother, Lori. She was the firm's bookkeeper for 38 years, before she retired in 2016. When I was a teenager, she used to sit me down at her kitchen table with a ledger and a mug of tea and teach me how to read it, column by column, the way other grandmothers teach baking. She used to say a ledger never lies to you, it just waits for you to ask the right question. I worked at the firm for a couple of years after college, starting in 2015. It didn't take long to understand I wasn't going to be the one clients asked for. By 2017, Heather was installed as the client-facing heir, and I was politely, quietly moved out of the way, so I left. I went and built my own career in public accounting, first in Portland, then back here in Bend, at a firm called Cascade Forensic and Advisory. I do forensic audits now. I trace money that doesn't want to be traced. I got promoted to director in 2024. My grandmother died in 2023. She was 81. The family estate went almost entirely to Heather. I got a plain cardboard box of Lori's old handwritten client ledgers, going back to the 1980s. I put it in my closet and didn't open it. I told myself I didn't need to relive the firm. I told myself I'd moved on. That box sat there for almost 3 years. It came out in the spring of this year at an ordinary Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Nothing special about the evening. My mother had made a roast. My father was pouring wine. Heather and her fiancé Travis were there talking about the wedding, which was still months away at that point. And so was Kurt Adkins. Kurt is 79. He's been a client of the firm since before I was born, and he was one of my grandmother's oldest friends. He still comes to family dinners sometimes, the way an old friend of the family just does, sitting in the same chair, telling the same 3 stories. I like Kurt. He asks real questions instead of small talk questions. That night, over the roast, he leaned toward me and asked what I did these days exactly at my job. I told him. Forensic audit, I said. I look at accounts and figure out where the money actually went versus where it was supposed to go. He got quiet for a second, and then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Funny you'd say that." My statement last quarter had this little disbursement on it I didn't recognize. Called the office about it. They told me it was a system error. I asked him what kind of amount we were talking about. "Not huge," he said. "Just enough to notice." They said it got corrected. I didn't think much of it. I remember smiling and telling him that was probably nothing. Banks make mistakes all the time. Systems glitch. I said it the way you say something you don't fully believe, just to keep a pleasant dinner pleasant. My mother was laughing at something Travis said. My father was refilling glasses. Heather was showing someone a photo of table linens on her phone. Nobody else at that table thought twice about what Kurt had just said. But I've spent years reading statements for a living, and system error is a phrase people use when they don't want to say the real phrase. It's the kind of answer you give someone you're hoping won't ask a second question. Kurt didn't ask a second question. He trusted the firm. He'd trusted it for decades because my grandmother built its reputation with her own two hands, one honest column at a time. I didn't say anything else about it that night. I helped clear the table. I hugged my parents goodbye. I told Heather the linens looked lovely, and she barely looked up from her phone to say thanks. But in the car, on the drive back to my condo, I kept turning it over. A small, unexplained disbursement, a vague explanation, an elderly client who trusted the people managing his money too much to ask twice. That's not a red flag on its own. I want to be clear about that. One old man, one vague answer. That's nothing. I've built a career on knowing the difference between nothing and something that's pretending to be nothing. Still, when I got home that night, I didn't go straight to bed. I stood in front of my closet for a minute, looking at that cardboard box on the shelf, the one with my grandmother's handwriting on the side in faded blue marker, client ledgers. I hadn't touched it in 3 years. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it was probably nothing, the same thing I'd told Kurt at the table. And I didn't fully believe it that time either. I pulled the box down, set it on my kitchen counter, and opened it for the first time since my grandmother's funeral. Inside were dozens of ledgers, her handwriting neat and small, decades of client histories going back to the 1980s. I recognized names I hadn't thought about in years. And near the middle of the stack, in a folder with a rubber band gone brittle with age, I found a name I knew very well, Kurt Adkins. I didn't read it that night. It was late, and I had work in the morning, and some part of me wasn't ready yet to find out whether I was about to turn a quiet family dinner into something else entirely. I just sat there at my counter for a long moment, looking at my grandmother's handwriting, thinking about how she used to tell me a ledger just waits for you to ask the right question. I closed the folder. I put the lid back on the box, but I didn't put it back in the closet. I left it on the counter where I'd see it every morning until I was ready to ask. I did not put it back in the closet. I left it on the counter where I'd see it every morning until I was ready to ask. It took me 4 days to be ready. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more that I knew once I opened that folder and actually did the work, I couldn't undo the knowing. So I let the box sit there through a Tuesday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, walking past it every morning on my way to make coffee, until Friday night, when I finally sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a calculator, and my grandmother's handwriting. Kurt Adkins' folder went back to 1989. Lori had logged every deposit, every withdrawal, every dividend reinvestment in a hand so neat it looked typed. I lined her old entries up against Kurt's account statements going back 3 years, the ones I'd asked him, very casually, to forward to me the week before, telling him I just wanted to look something over for him as a favor. He didn't ask why, he just said, "Of course, sweetheart," and emailed them the next morning. I found the first one around midnight. A line item on his statement from October listed as an administrative reallocation, $1,100, moved out of his growth account and never moved back in. I checked Lori's decades of records for anything resembling that language. Nothing. Not once, in 38 years, had she ever used the phrase administrative reallocation. She had categories for fees, for corrections, for transfers between accounts, all labeled plainly, all explainable in one glance. This wasn't her language. This was somebody else's language dressed up to look like paperwork. I found a second one in December, then a third in February. Small amounts. Never the same number twice. Never large enough, on their own, to make a 79-year-old man call his bank in a panic. Just large enough to add up. I sat there at my table until almost 2 in the morning, running the numbers 3 times because that's what you do when you don't want to believe your own math. 3 times the same pattern. I closed the laptop and I remember saying it out loud to my empty kitchen, quietly like a fact I was filing away rather than a feeling I was having. That's not a system error. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Heather. I want to be clear about that because for a long time, that was still the family I was hoping I could quietly bring an answer back to, instead of a problem. So I did what I do for a living. I gathered more. I thought about who else might have seen something. And that's when I thought of Shelby Romero. Shelby had worked client services at the firm for almost 6 years before she resigned, sometime the year before. I remembered her as sharp, careful, the kind of person who double-checked everything twice before she'd put her name on it. We'd never been close while I still worked there, but we'd kept in loose touch since, the way you do with people you respected but didn't have a reason to see anymore. I sent her a text on a Sunday. Nothing dramatic, just, "Hey, it's been a while. Would you want to grab coffee sometime this week?" She wrote back within the hour. "Sure. When?" We met on a Wednesday morning at a coffee shop on the west side, one of those places with the good light and the bad chairs. Shelby got there before I did. She had her coat still on when I sat down, like she hadn't decided yet whether she was staying. We did the small talk first. "How's the new job? How's your mom? Are you doing anything for the 4th of July?" I let her set the pace. I've learned that people tell you more when they don't feel like you're pulling it out of them. Eventually, I said it plainly because Shelby was never someone who needed things softened for her. I told her I'd been looking at some of the firm's old client files, comparing them to some current statements, and that I'd found something that didn't sit right with me. I didn't say Kurt's name yet. I just said an elderly client, a pattern of small reallocations, nothing in the old records that matched. Shelby went very still. She wrapped both hands around her cup like it was the only warm thing in the room. "I was wondering when someone was going to ask me about that," she said. "I didn't say anything. I just waited, the way my grandmother taught me a ledger waits." Shelby looked at the door once, like she was checking whether anyone she knew had walked in, and then she looked back at me and said it low and fast, the way people say things they've been carrying around too long. Before I left, she said, "Heather asked me to backdate a form." I asked her what kind of form. "A discretionary trading authorization," she said, "for one of the older clients. She told me the client had verbally agreed to it months earlier and we'd just, quote, missed the paperwork. She wanted me to print a new one, get it signed, and date it back to when she said the conversation happened. I asked her if she did it." Shelby's jaw tightened. "I did the first one," she said. "I didn't ask enough questions. I told myself it was just cleaning up something that was already true. But she asked me for a second one about 2 months later, and that time I said no. I told her I wasn't comfortable with it, and she told me I was overreacting, that this was normal, that this was how the office had always handled things with clients who forgot to sign paperwork on time. I quit about 6 weeks after that. I sat with that for a second before I asked the question I actually needed answered. "Do you remember which client the first one was?" Shelby hesitated, and I watched her decide whether 6 years of loyalty to a family firm was worth more than whatever she was feeling across that table from me. Then she said a name I already knew, Kurt Adkins. I didn't react the way I wanted to react, which was not at all gracefully. I just nodded, slow, like she'd confirmed something about the weather. I asked her if she remembered roughly when that would have been. "Last spring," she said, "maybe around April or May of last year." I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her telling me and that I understood exactly what it cost her to say it. She looked relieved and terrified in the same breath, the way people look when they've finally put something down they'd been carrying alone for over a year. Before we got up to leave, she asked me the question I'd been waiting for. "What are you going to do with this?" I told her the truth. "I don't know yet. I need to see the actual form before I do anything with a name attached to it." She nodded like that made sense to her, professionally, the way it would to anyone who'd worked around paperwork long enough to know that a story and a signed document are two very different kinds of proof. I walked her to her car afterward. Neither of us said much. Before she pulled away, she rolled her window down and said one more thing. "I'm not saying this to hurt anyone, Megan. I just don't want to be the only one who knew and didn't say anything." I told her she wasn't. Not anymore. I drove home with the radio off, running through what I actually had. A pattern of unexplained reallocations that didn't match 38 years of clean records. A former employee describing a backdated authorization on the exact same client's account. 2 separate threads from 2 separate people who had no reason to coordinate a story, both pointing at the same 79-year-old man's money and the same sister who'd spent her whole life being the one everyone trusted in that office. It still wasn't proof. Not the kind I could put in front of anyone and expect them to act on. Shelby's memory was a person's word. What I needed was the document itself, the one with Kurt's actual signature and an actual date on it, sitting in a file at the office I used to work in. And there was exactly one clean way to get access to that file without asking my family for permission to look. I needed Kurt to ask for it himself. I called Kurt on a Thursday morning before work while I still had my coffee in hand and hadn't talked myself out of it. I didn't tell him what I suspected. I've learned that if you tell someone what you're looking for before you look, you start seeing it whether it's there or not. So I kept it simple. I told him that as a professional courtesy, since I did this kind of work for a living, I'd be glad to do a full review of his account, at no charge, just to make sure everything on his statements matched up the way it should. All I needed from him was a signed release, authorizing the firm to send me a copy of his file. He didn't hesitate. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, same as he had with the statements. "Lori would have liked that, you looking after her old friends." That line sat in my chest longer than I expected it to. He drove down to my office 2 days later and signed the release in person at my conference table, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, asking me twice if he was signing it in the right place. I told him he was. I walked him out afterward and he patted my hand and told me to tell my mother hello. I faxed the release to the firm myself, using the office's general line, the same fax number that had been printed on the bottom of client forms since before I was born. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want anyone deciding to have a conversation about it first. 3 business days later, an envelope showed up at my office with Kurt's full file inside, the way any client's authorized representative would receive it. Nobody flagged it. Nobody called to ask why. I was, on paper, exactly what I said I was, a professional doing a favor for an old man. I waited until that evening to open it, at my kitchen table next to my grandmother's box, like I wanted both generations of paperwork in the room at the same time. The discretionary trading authorization was near the back of the file, a single page, Kurt's signature at the bottom in the shaky, careful hand of a man who takes his time signing things. Dated April of last year. I sat with that for a second. Shelby had told me the conversation about backdating happened last spring, around April or May. The date on the form matched that window exactly. On the surface, nothing looked wrong at all. But I'd spent an hour with Kurt at my conference table 2 days earlier, and somewhere in the small talk, while he was signing the release, he'd mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been in Arizona visiting his son for 6 weeks last spring, all through April and most of May, because his son's wife had just had a second baby. He'd shown me a photo on his phone, unprompted, proud grandfather showing off a photo, a baby in a hospital blanket, the date stamp right there in the corner of the picture, April the 9th. I went back and looked at the signature date on the authorization form again, April the 14th. I called Kurt that same night. I asked him, as gently as I could, whether he remembered signing any paperwork at the office around the middle of April last year. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Honey, I wasn't even in the state in April. I was holding my great-granddaughter in a hospital room in Tucson. I didn't come back to Bend until the end of May." I asked him if he was sure. He laughed, not unkindly. "Sweetheart, I have the pictures to prove it." I thanked him and told him it was probably nothing, another clerical thing, and that I'd let him know if I found anything worth mentioning. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my kitchen for a long time. A man who was in Arizona in April cannot sign a form in Bend, Oregon in April. That's not a system error. That's not a clerical thing. That's a form somebody printed later and dated earlier. The exact thing Shelby had described to me over coffee, sitting right there on Kurt's actual paperwork, with his actual signature, which meant either he signed something blank or under pressure, or he signed it at a completely different time, and somebody typed a different date onto the top of the page after the fact. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about my grandmother's handwriting in that ledger, decades of it. Never once a category invented to explain something away. And I kept thinking about the fact that whoever asked Shelby to backdate that first form worked directly with Heather, which meant this wasn't an accident happening somewhere out at the edges of the firm. This was happening inside the room where my sister sat every day. I told myself I still didn't know enough. I told myself that before I did anything with what I had, I owed my family the chance to explain it. Because as much as I'd been the quiet one my whole life, I was still theirs, and this was still ours. So, I brought it up at dinner. It was a Sunday again, 3 weeks after the coffee with Shelby, at my parents' house. The table set the same way it always was, my mother's roast, my father pouring wine, Heather going on about a florist who kept changing her mind about peonies. I waited until there was a lull, the kind that happens naturally between courses, and I said it as plainly and as calmly as I could. I told them I'd been looking into some inconsistencies in a client's account. I didn't say Kurt's name at first. I said there were unexplained reallocations that didn't match the old records, and that I'd also heard, from someone who used to work there, that authorization forms had been backdated on at least one account. The table went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with anyone chewing. My mother set her fork down first. "Megan," she said, her voice gone careful and bright the way it gets when she's trying to steer a conversation somewhere else without seeming like she's steering it. "Whatever this is, can it wait? Your sister has a wedding in a few weeks. I really don't think this is the time." I told her it wasn't about timing. I told her it was about an 82-year-old man's money. My father set his wine glass down harder than he needed to. He didn't look at me when he answered. He said the firm reviews its own compliance regularly, that these things get flagged and corrected all the time in an office that size, that I, of all people, should know paperwork gets messy sometimes, and it doesn't mean what I was implying it meant. I asked him what exactly he thought I was implying. He didn't answer that. He picked his wine glass back up instead and asked my mother, too casually, whether there was more of the roast left. Heather hadn't said a word this whole time. She was looking down at her plate, moving a piece of carrot around with her fork, and when she finally looked up, her face wasn't angry. It was something closer to bored, like I'd brought up an old argument nobody wanted to have again. "Megan," she said, "you left the firm almost 10 years ago. You don't actually know how any of this works anymore." I told her I knew exactly how a ledger works, and that the numbers weren't adding up, and that a man who trusted this family his whole life deserved somebody to at least ask the question. My mother reached over and put her hand on my arm, the way she used to when I was a kid, and she wanted me to lower my voice in public. "Please," she said, "not right now. Not before the wedding. Can you just let her have this?" I did not respond right away. I looked around that table, at my father refusing to meet my eyes, at my mother's hand still resting on my arm like a soft kind of pressure, at Heather already reaching for the peony conversation, again like the last 2 minutes hadn't happened at all. And I understood something in that moment I probably should have understood years earlier. This wasn't going to be a family conversation. It was never going to be a family conversation. It was going to be a business problem. And business problems get solved by people whose job it is to solve them, not by people who love you too much to look at what you've done. I told them I understood, and I let the subject drop. I finished my dinner. I complimented the roast. I hugged my parents goodbye and told Heather the peonies would look beautiful whatever she decided. And I meant it because none of what I'd found had anything to do with flowers. I drove home in silence again. When I got to my condo, I didn't go straight to bed. I sat down on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, my grandmother's box open beside me, Kurt's file spread out on the tile in front of me like a hand of cards nobody else at that table wanted to look at. I talked to the box. I know how that sounds, but my grandmother taught me everything I know about reading numbers honestly. And some nights, when there's nobody else who'll listen the way she used to, it helps to say things out loud to the person who taught you to say them at all. I told her I didn't want to be the one who did this. I told her I'd tried to let the family handle it, and they weren't going to, because handling it meant admitting it, and nobody in that house was ready to admit anything 2 weeks before a wedding. I started saying the words out loud, quietly, the way you rehearse something before a job interview. I have reason to believe that discretionary authority on at least one client account was obtained through a backdated form. I have documentation showing reallocations that don't match historical account activity. I said it again, cleaner the second time. Again, cleaner still the third. I wasn't rehearsing it for my parents anymore. I understood that even as I sat there on the floor. I was rehearsing it for someone whose entire job was to listen to exactly this kind of sentence and do something with it. I just didn't know yet who that person was going to be, or how much worse the number was going to get before I finally picked up the phone and said it to them instead of to an empty kitchen. I kept saying it to the box until the words stopped shaking, and then I stopped talking to the box and went back to work, because sympathy wasn't going to get Kurt his money back, and it wasn't going to fix whatever my father already knew and wasn't saying. I gave myself 2 weeks. I told myself if I couldn't find anything beyond Kurt by the end of June, I'd let it sit. I'd let the regulators or the auditors or whoever eventually caught it do their job without me. I didn't believe that when I said it. I don't think I believed it the moment it left my mouth. But it felt like a reasonable thing to tell myself at midnight, so I let myself have it. I pulled 6 more files. Not through Cascade, not on the clock, not touching a single system that belonged to my employer. I did it the same clean way I'd done Kurt's, one signed release at a time, one old client at a time, people Lori had kept ledgers on for decades, people who still called the office and asked for Dennis by name because they didn't trust anybody younger than 60 with their money. An 86-year-old widow named Dolores, who'd been a client since 1994. A retired dentist and his wife who'd been with the firm even longer than that. 2 brothers who'd inherited their accounts from their own father, another old friend of Lori's from the early days. Every one of them said yes before I finished asking. Every one of them said some version of the same thing Kurt had said to me. "You're Lori's granddaughter." Of course. That's the part that still gets me, if I let it. Not the numbers. The trust. 40 years of trust, built by a woman who used to double-check her own subtraction by hand because she didn't like relying on a calculator for other people's money. And it was being spent down like a line of credit. Nobody told the account holders they'd opened. By the 2nd of July, I had 7 files spread across my kitchen table, 7 sets of statements going back 18 months, 7 versions of the same small, quiet inconsistency. Never a huge number at once. Never anything that would trip an alarm on its own. A reallocation here, an administrative adjustment there. Amounts that looked, individually, like the kind of thing a busy office might genuinely mishandle. I built a spreadsheet the way Cassandra taught me to build one. Every entry sourced, every date cross-referenced, nothing asserted that I couldn't point to on a page. When I added the column all the way down, it came to $340,000. I sat back from the table and looked at that number for a long time. Then I did the thing I hadn't let myself do until I had the whole picture in front of me. I pulled up the firm's public vendor filings, the kind any accountant knows how to find, and I lined up the dates of the reallocations against the dates of deposits going out to a florist, a caterer, a venue out along the Deschutes River, a photographer, a company that rents string lights and barn furniture for weddings. I didn't have to squint to see it. The reallocations clustered right before the vendor deposits, almost every time close enough that it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a payment schedule. It wasn't just that my sister was expensive. I'd always known that. It was that the firm itself didn't have $340,000 sitting around to cover her wedding and whatever else was quietly bleeding out of it. And somebody with access to 7 elderly clients' discretionary accounts had decided those accounts could function as a line of credit nobody had agreed to extend. My father ran that firm. My father signed off on cash flow. My father was the one client conversations went through when an account needed a second signature. I didn't want to finish that thought. I made myself finish it anyway because half finishing it wasn't going to protect Kurt or Dolores or anyone else on that table. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat with the spreadsheet open and I thought about every version of the conversation I could have with my parents, and every version ended the same way it had at that Sunday dinner, with my mother's hand on my arm and my father reaching for his wine glass instead of my eyes. I wasn't going to get a different result by asking the same people the same question a second time. Lori used to say that. If the number's wrong twice in the same direction, stop checking your addition. Start checking who's writing the entries. On the 6th of July, a Monday, I called the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation before I let myself second-guess it. I got transferred twice before I reached someone named Julie O'Brien, a compliance officer who had the patient, unhurried voice of a person who has heard 100 nervous callers try to explain something they're not sure is actually a crime. I told her I wanted to file a whistleblower referral. She asked me to start with my relationship to the firm. I told her plainly that I used to work there, that I no longer had any financial interest in it, and that I currently worked as a director of forensic audit at Cascade Forensic and Advisory. She asked if that created a conflict. I told her it might, and that if her office needed an independent review at any point, Cascade could be walled off from me specifically with an internal ethics screen, the same kind we used any time a case touched somebody's family. She wrote that down. I could hear her typing. Then she asked me to walk her through what I had. I did it the way I'd rehearsed it on my kitchen floor, except this time somebody was actually listening and writing it into a file that had a number attached to it. I told her about Kurt Adkins' account and the disbursement he'd flagged himself. I told her about the pattern across 7 client accounts, all elderly, all with discretionary authority on file. I told her about the backdated authorization, the Arizona trip, the photograph with a date stamp in the corner of a hospital room. I told her the total came to $340,000 over roughly 18 months. I told her about the timing against the vendor deposits, and I made sure to say clearly that I couldn't prove intent, only pattern, because that's the line you don't cross when you're the one filing the report instead of the one deciding the outcome. Julie asked me to send everything I had in writing, every statement, every comparison, every date. I told her I'd have it to her office by the end of the day. She thanked me, and then she said something I've thought about more than once since. She said, "Most people who call us have half of what you have and twice as much anger. You brought the opposite. That'll matter." I sent the file that afternoon. 7 client names, 18 months of reallocations, 1 altered signature date, with the flight and hospital documentation attached to support it. I named Norris Wealth Advisors in the subject line without flinching, and I named my own employer 2 lines below it, in case anyone needed to check whether I had anything to gain. I closed my laptop after I hit send, and I sat in my kitchen, and I did not feel the relief I thought I'd feel. I felt the particular kind of quiet that comes after you've done something you can't undo. The same quiet I imagine surgeons feel after the first cut, when there's no version of the next hour that doesn't involve seeing it through to the end. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Heather. I didn't tell anyone except Cassandra 2 days later, in her office with the door closed, because if this was going to touch my firm's name at all, she needed to hear it from me before she heard it from a regulator. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting me once. When I finished, she asked me one question: "Are you sure?" I told her I was. She nodded, made a note, and told me Cascade would stand behind whatever came of it, screen in place, no exceptions. That was it. No lecture. No warning about family loyalty. Just a woman who ran an accounting firm treating a set of facts like a set of facts. After that, there was nothing left to do but wait. and let the wedding come toward me the way it had been coming toward all of us for months, one dress fitting and one seating chart at a time, while I carried around a secret none of them knew I was holding, and none of them, especially Heather, had any idea how close the ground already was to moving under her feet. The wedding was 5 days away when the wait finally stopped being quiet. I kept going to work like a normal person. I ran 2 other audits that week, unrelated to any of this, because Cascade doesn't pause for a person's family, and neither does a caseload. I answered emails. I ate lunch at my desk. And underneath all of it, every single hour, some part of me was waiting for a phone to ring that wasn't mine to answer. I didn't know it yet, but on the Monday morning, the 13th of July, my father's phone was the one that rang. I'd learned the shape of that call much later, after all of this was already public record, after there was no reason left to keep it private. The firm's compliance attorney called him before 9 in the morning. She told him the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation had opened a formal examination into Norris Wealth Advisors. She told him discretionary trading authority on the flagged accounts was suspended, effective immediately. No discussion, no appeal period before it took hold. She told him client notification letters were required by law within 5 business days, and that the clock had already started the moment the notice went out. 5 business days from a Monday puts you at the following Monday. My sister's wedding was that Saturday. My father did the math the way he does math on everything else in that office, fast and self-serving, and he understood before he hung up the phone that he had exactly 1 weekend where the truth hadn't legally reached anyone's mailbox yet. He told no one, not my mother, not Heather. He went to work that day like it was any other Monday, and he came home that night and ate dinner at the same table where I'd tried to say something plain 3 weeks earlier. And he said nothing because saying something meant admitting there was something to say. I know now that he made a decision that morning, quietly, the same way he'd made every other decision in that firm for the last 11 years. He decided to get through the wedding first. Whatever came after, he'd deal with after. I didn't know any of that on the Monday. What I knew on the Monday was that my mother called me that evening, her voice doing the bright, careful thing it does, asking if I could come by Wednesday to help steam the bridesmaid dresses before they went to the venue. I said yes. I always say yes to that kind of thing. It's easier than explaining why I might say no. Wednesday, I stood in my parents' garage with a handheld steamer, working the wrinkles out of pale green chiffon, while my mother folded programs at the workbench behind me and talked about seating charts like they were the only thing that mattered in the world that week. At some point, she mentioned, almost in passing, that I'd been quiet lately, distracted, and she hoped I wasn't still stewing over that thing I'd brought up at dinner. I told her I wasn't stewing. I told her I was just busy with work. That was true in its way. What I didn't know was that later that same week, my mother said something to Heather that she probably meant as reassurance, and that landed as a warning shot instead. I only pieced this part together afterward from things Heather said in the moment and things my mother admitted much later, sitting across from me at a coffee shop with her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. My mother told Heather not to worry about me, that I'd been asking some strange questions about the firm a few weeks back, something about old clients and paperwork, but that she'd handled it, that I'd let it go. That was the sentence that did the damage. Not the questions themselves, the fact that Heather now knew they existed. Heather has spent her whole life reading a room before anyone else finishes walking into it. That's the skill our parents built her whole career on, and it's a real skill, whatever else is true about her. So when she heard that her sister had been quietly asking questions about the firm's paperwork 3 weeks before her wedding, she didn't hear it as an old family disagreement that had already been resolved. She heard it as a threat that hadn't gone away, just gone underground. She didn't call me to ask. She didn't call Julie O'Brien's office because she had no idea that office existed yet. No idea a notice with her family's name on it was already sitting in a compliance file with a clock running against it. She had no idea any of that was real. All she had was a feeling and a wedding 4 days out, and a room full of guests who were, more than half of them, her own family's clients. I found out what she decided to do with that feeling the same way everyone else in that barn found out. All at once in front of a microphone, but that was still days away. On the Thursday, 2 days before the wedding, I drove out to the venue with my mother to drop off the last of the centerpiece boxes. And Heather met us there in jeans and a ponytail, walking the barn floor with the wedding planner, pointing at where she wanted the head table angled so the light off the river would hit it right at sunset. She looked happy. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this story like she was plotting something cruel the whole week, calculating, cold. She wasn't. She was a woman 2 days from marrying someone she loved, carrying a private fear she hadn't told anyone about, and she handled that fear the only way she'd ever been taught to handle anything uncomfortable in that family. She got ahead of it before anyone else could say it first. She hugged me when she saw me. She told me my dress fit perfectly at the final fitting, that I was going to make her cry walking down the aisle before she even got there herself. I hugged her back. I meant it, too, the part where I was glad she looked happy. I didn't know yet what she was going to do with that happiness once she felt it slipping. I drove home that night past the turn for the Deschutes River, past the sign for Aspen Ridge Ranch, that would, in 2 days, have string lights wound through the fence posts and 120 folding chairs set up facing the water. I didn't feel dread exactly. I felt the particular stillness that comes before something you can't stop and can't speed up either. Somewhere in a compliance file at the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation, a 5-day clock was already most of the way through, counting itself down. Somewhere in my father's chest, a secret was sitting exactly where he decided to leave it. And somewhere in my sister's mind, a plan was forming that she believed, genuinely believed, would protect her. None of us were wrong about the wedding coming. We were all wrong about what it was going to hold. I got to the venue Saturday morning before anyone else in the family, because that's what I do. I check locations before I trust them. The barn at Aspen Ridge Ranch sat low and long against the tree line, the river moving behind it, slow and green, and the wedding planner had already strung the lights Heather wanted, white bulbs looping from post to post like something out of a catalog. I stood in the gravel lot for a minute with my garment bag over my arm, and I let myself feel exactly one thing before I walked in. I let myself be glad for her that the weather had turned out clear. Inside, my mother was already crying about nothing in particular, the way she does at every family event, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she kept in the sleeve of her dress, like she'd planned for this moment for weeks. She probably had. She hugged me too hard and told me I looked beautiful and asked me quietly, under the noise of the room, if I was going to be okay today. I told her I was fine. She held my face in both hands for a second, the way she used to when I was small, and said, "Just be happy for your sister today, Megan. Please." I told her I would be. I meant it when I said it. I didn't know yet what the day still had folded up inside it. My father found me by the coffee station an hour later, dressed in his good suit, doing the thing he does with his cufflinks when he's nervous, turning them over and over between his fingers like worry stones. He asked me how work was. I told him it was fine. Busy. Nothing new. He nodded like that answer satisfied something in him, and I watched his eyes do a thing I hadn't seen them do before, a kind of scanning, like he was checking the exits in a room he'd walked into 1,000 times. I didn't know yet what he was carrying. I only knew that my father, who has never once in my life looked unsettled at a family gathering, looked unsettled at his own daughter's wedding, and some old instinct in me filed that away without knowing what to do with it. The ceremony happened along the river, folding chairs and even rows facing the water, a simple arch woven with the same kind of greenery that had been in the centerpiece boxes I'd steamed dresses next to on Wednesday. I sat on the aisle 3 rows back, and I watched my sister walk down that grass in a dress that fit her the way good tailoring is supposed to. And I watched Travis Thompson's face when he saw her, and I want to say plainly that it was a real moment. I felt it the way you feel weather change. Whatever else was true about Heather, whatever she had done or was about to do, she loved this man, and he loved her. And neither of those two facts had anything to do with the other truth sitting quietly in a compliance file 200 miles away in Salem. I looked out at the rows of chairs while the officiant talked about promises, and I did the thing I do without meaning to anymore. I counted the room. Habit from the job. I counted maybe 80 guests on the water side, and out of that 80, I recognized at least a dozen faces from client files I'd never officially seen, but had absorbed anyway, growing up in that office as a teenager, filing folders after school for my grandmother. There was Kurt Adkins, in a pressed blazer, sitting near the back with his hands folded in his lap. Here because he'd known this family for decades, because Lori had been like a sister to him, because he had no idea yet that his own account had spent 18 months quietly bleeding into the flowers he was currently looking at. There was a woman 2 rows up I recognized as a longtime client of my father's, a retired school teacher who'd had her portfolio with Norris Wealth Advisors since before I was born. I counted them without wanting to. I couldn't stop myself. My whole job is counting the things other people don't want counted. The reception moved into the barn as the light went gold over the water, exactly the way Heather had planned it. Long tables, string lights doubled up against the dark timber, a band setting up in the corner near a dance floor laid down over the old wood planks. I found my place card near the family table, not at it, which was normal, which had always been normal. Heather's table, Travis's table, then everyone else radiating outward by how close you were to the center of things. I sat with my mother's sister and a cousin I hadn't seen in 2 years, and I made the kind of small talk you make at these events. And underneath it, the whole time, some part of me kept checking my phone, not because I expected anything, but because checking had become a habit over the last 12 days, the way you keep touching a bruise to see if it still hurts. Dinner came and went. Speeches started the way they always do, a little late, a little disorganized, the best man fumbling with a note card, Travis's mother saying something warm and short about gaining a daughter. I watched my father during all of it. He laughed at the right moments. He raised his glass at the right moments. But there was a stiffness in his shoulders that hadn't been there at any other family dinner I could remember. A man performing ease instead of feeling it. And I understood, watching him, that whatever he was holding it alone. My mother didn't have that same stiffness. She was simply, fully happy, the kind of happy that doesn't leave room to notice anything underneath it. Somewhere around the middle of the toasts, my sister stood up. She wasn't on the list. I know that because the wedding planner had a printed schedule taped inside the folder by the gift table, and Heather's name wasn't on it, not for a speech of her own. Brides don't usually give unplanned toasts at their own reception. But Heather has never in her life waited for a schedule to hand her a microphone when she wanted one, and she crossed the dance floor in her wedding dress with a glass of champagne in one hand, smiling the smile she uses on clients, warm and open and completely in control of the room, and she reached out and took the microphone from the band's singer with the easy confidence of a woman who has never once been told no, in a room full of people watching her. The barn went quiet the way rooms go quiet for a bride. Every face turned toward her. My mother's hand came up to her chest. My father set his glass down very carefully, like it had gotten heavier in the last 5 seconds. And for the first time all day, I saw something on his face that looked less like nerves and more like dread. A man watching a car start to slide on ice he already knew was there. I sat very still at my table with my own glass halfway to my mouth, and I looked at my sister standing in the gold light with 100 people's eyes on her, and some old, useless part of me, the part that had spent 33 years learning to read that exact posture from across every room we'd ever shared, understood before she said a single word that she was about to do something she believed would protect her. She lifted the microphone to her mouth the way she lifts a glass of wine at these things, easy, familiar, like it belonged in her hand. "I just want to say one quick thing before we cut the cake," she said, and the room laughed a little, warm, indulgent, The way a room laughs at a bride who's earned the right to hold the floor a minute longer. Some of you have been asking me things this week. Little questions. You know how this town is. She let that sit, smiling out at the tables, and I felt my stomach go still in the particular way it does right before a number comes back wrong. I don't want anybody whispering instead of just asking me, she said, so I'm going to save you the trouble. My sister was let go from her firm last month. She said it lightly. That's the part I keep coming back to. She said it the way you'd mention a change in the weather, something regrettable but nobody's fault. And she turned her head just slightly toward my table so that 120 folding chairs worth of guests turned with her. It happens, she went on. Numbers people burn out. There's no shame in it. I just didn't want anyone to hear a version of it that wasn't kind. I didn't cry. I never have at the moments that were supposed to break me, and this one didn't either. My face did the thing it does at work when a client hands me a spreadsheet that's been quietly cooked for years, still, unbothered, waiting. I didn't stand up. I didn't correct her in front of 80 people holding champagne. I set my fork down next to my plate, and I looked at her the way I look at a number that doesn't reconcile. Not with anger, just with attention. My mother's hand came up over her mouth, not in agreement, in shock. I could see even from 3 tables away that this wasn't a line Heather had run past her first, that whatever my mother had let slip in a garage full of steaming chiffon had traveled somewhere she never meant it to go. My father didn't move at all. He sat with his glass in front of him, untouched, and his eyes went to me instead of to her, and for 1 second I saw something in his face that wasn't surprise. It was the look of a man watching a second wave come in behind the one he'd already been bracing for. Kurt Adkins, near the back in his pressed blazer, leaned toward the woman next to him and said something I couldn't hear, and I understood without needing to hear it that the sentence traveling through that barn right now had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with velocity. A rumor doesn't need to be true to move fast. It only needs a bride holding a microphone and a room that loves her. I counted the faces turned toward me. 11 at my own table alone. I counted the seconds it took for the first murmur to start. Low, table to table. The specific hum of people deciding what to believe before anyone's asked them to. Habit from the job. I count what other people don't want counted. And right then what nobody wanted counted was how many of Norris Wealth Advisors' own clients were sitting in that barn hearing, secondhand, that the sister who kept asking questions about their accounts had just been quietly discredited before she ever got the chance to ask one out loud. Heather smiled again, satisfied, the smile of a woman who believes she has just closed a door before anyone could walk through it, and she raised her glass toward my table like she was offering me something. Anyway, she said, "Love you, Meg. Truly." The band picked the moment back up before I had to decide what my face was going to do next. A few warm chords rolling in under the applause, and Heather handed the microphone back to the singer and turned into Travis's arms, laughing, already moving on to the next thing the night owed her. My mother reached across the space between our tables and gripped my wrist, whispering that she hadn't known, that she was so sorry, that she didn't understand why Heather would say something like that in front of everyone. I told her it was fine. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was just not yet the truth, which is a different thing entirely. Truth is the slowest receipt there is. It doesn't arrive with the announcement. It arrives after, itemized, addressed, impossible to argue with once it's in your hand. My phone was face down on the table beside my water glass, where it had been sitting all night, mostly forgotten under the noise of speeches and silverware. It buzzed once against the tablecloth, a short, ordinary vibration, the kind that could have been anything, a calendar reminder, a text from a friend asking how the wedding was going. I almost let it sit there another minute, the way you let most things sit at a family event where everyone's watching how you carry yourself. But something in me, the part that spent 6 years learning never to leave a notification unread when the timing feels wrong, turned the phone over. The screen lit up bright against the dim gold light of the barn, and the first thing I saw was the name at the top, Cassandra Phillips, my CEO. Not a name that had any business appearing on my phone on a Saturday night at my sister's wedding. Not unless something had happened that couldn't wait until Monday. I sat very still with the phone in my hand, the applause still settling around me, my mother still murmuring something apologetic into my shoulder, and I read the subject line twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Below it, the first 2 lines of the email were already visible on the lock screen, enough to tell me this wasn't a mistake, wasn't spam, wasn't anything that could wait. Someone from that barn, some guest holding a glass of champagne 20 feet from where I sat, had already called my office tonight to ask if the rumor was true. And my CEO, following the only protocol she was allowed to follow right now, had already answered them in writing, with an attachment I hadn't asked for and couldn't have written myself if I'd tried. I looked up from the screen, across the tables, past my mother's stricken face and my father's stillness, to where my sister stood laughing in her wedding dress with a room full of her own clients around her, and I understood, in the space of one breath, that the door she thought she'd just closed had never actually been hers to close. I opened the email with my thumb, right there at the table, because some things you don't wait to read in private. The subject line said, "Re-inquiry regarding Megan Norris, employment status." Below it, Cassandra had written 4 sentences, clean and flat, the kind of writing she does when she knows a document might end up somewhere other than an inbox. Megan Norris remains a current, full-time director of forensic audit at Cascade Forensic and Advisory. She has not been terminated, suspended, or placed on leave at any point in her tenure. Any suggestion to the contrary is false. Per firm policy during an active regulatory matter involving a referred entity, I am required to include the attached notice in any response to an inquiry of this nature. There was a paperclip icon under the 4th line. 1 attachment. I tapped it and the screen filled with a scanned document, state seal in the corner, the kind of formatting nobody designs to be pretty. Notice of examination. Oregon Division of Financial Regulation. Addressed to Norris Wealth Advisors, dated the 13th of July, 5 days ago. My thumb found the second page without me telling it to, the way your hand finds a light switch in your own house in the dark, and there it was, a list of account numbers I didn't need to decode, because I already knew every one of them by heart. Kurt Adkins's account was the 3rd one down. I set the phone flat on the tablecloth and I looked at it for a second longer than I needed to, not because I doubted what I was reading, but because some part of me wanted one more breath before the room found out too. My mother was still murmuring beside me, still holding my wrist, still building a version of the night where a private apology fixed everything. I turned my hand over under hers and I said her name once, quiet, just to get her eyes on mine instead of on the middle distance. I did not raise my voice. I never have. I stood up from my chair the way you stand up in a meeting when you have the floor, unhurried, because the fastest way to lose a room is to look like you're chasing it. The barn was still loud with the after noise of Heather's toast, silverware and low talk, and the band easing into something soft under the chatter. And for a second, nobody noticed one more person on her feet. Then Kurt Adkins, near the back, turned his head toward me, the way an old man turns toward a sound he's been listening for without knowing it. That was enough. Heads followed his. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, and my voice carried further than I expected it to in that open room, the way sound does under a barn roof with no carpet to soak it up. But since my sister brought up my employment in front of everyone, I think everyone deserves the correction, and not just from me. Heather's smile didn't move at first. It just went a little fixed, the way a smile does when the person wearing it is doing math behind it. I picked the phone back up. "This is an email from my CEO," I said, Cassandra Phillips. She sent it 11 minutes ago, because apparently someone here called my office tonight to ask if what Heather said was true. I let my eyes move across the tables, not accusing, just noting, the way I note anything. I don't need to know who. It doesn't matter. What matters is what she had to say back. I read it out loud. I didn't paraphrase it, and I didn't soften it. I read the line about remaining a current full-time director. I read the line about never being terminated, suspended, or placed on leave. I read the words, "Any suggestion to the contrary is false." And I watched those 5 words land on my mother's face like weather. Then I got to the part about the attachment, and I looked up before I said it, because I wanted to see my father's eyes when I did. She said she was required to include this, I said, because of an active regulatory matter involving a referred entity. I turned the phone so the light from the screen caught the room, even though nobody at the far tables could actually read it from there, because that was never the point. The point was saying the words out loud, where everyone could hear them land. It's a notice of examination from the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation, dated 5 days ago, addressed to Norris Wealth Advisors. The band had stopped without anyone telling them to. I noticed that the way you notice a room getting colder, all at once, everywhere. It names client accounts, I said. 7 of them, right now. I recognize every account number on this page because I've spent the last 3 months finding them one at a time. I looked past Heather, past the flowers to where my father sat with his hand flat on the tablecloth, like he was holding the table down. Discretionary trading authority on those accounts was suspended the day this notice took effect. Last Monday. Not tonight, last Monday. I let that sit a second because I wanted it understood as a fact and not a threat, which means whatever anyone in this room was told about their accounts being handled as usual this week, that wasn't true either. Kurt Adkins stood up slowly at the back table, one hand braced on the chair in front of him, and in the dead quiet of that barn, his voice carried clean across the whole room. "Is that my account, Megan?" "It's on the list, Kurt," I said. "I'm sorry. You'll get a letter about it. The law requires one by Monday." My mother's hand had come away from my wrist entirely now. She was looking at my father, not at me, and I watched something happen on her face that I'd never once seen there before, not in 33 years, a kind of arithmetic she'd never had to do, my husband knew, and he let our daughter say her vows before he told any of us. My father didn't defend himself. That was the part that told me everything. A man with nothing to hide argues. A man with something to hide goes very, very still, and my father went still the way water goes still right before it's about to be disturbed from underneath. He didn't look at Heather. He looked at the tablecloth in front of him, and his jaw worked once, and he said nothing at all. And the silence coming off him was its own kind of confession, louder in that room than anything I could have said myself. Heather was still holding her champagne glass. I watched her knuckles go white around the stem. "You're lying," she said. But there was no heat behind it, just the reflex of a woman reaching for the only weapon she had left, and it came out thin, unconvincing even to her own ears, I think, because her eyes weren't on me anymore. They were on our father, waiting for him to say something, anything, to make this stop being real. He didn't. "I'm not," I said. "I filed a referral on the 6th of July. I didn't do it to ruin your wedding, Heather. I did it because Kurt Adkins is 79 years old, and somebody's been moving his money for 18 months and calling it a system error. I kept my voice level, the way I keep it in every room where a number won't reconcile. The state opened an examination on its own timeline, not mine. I didn't choose today. You did when you decided to stand up with a microphone and make this about me instead of just letting your wedding be your wedding." Nobody at the surrounding tables was pretending not to listen anymore. 120 guests, most of them holding forks they'd stopped using, and I found, moving slowly across those faces, at least a dozen more I recognized now that I was looking for them on purpose. People who trusted this family with the money they had left to grow old on. I watched 2 of them lean toward each other and start talking low and fast, phones already coming out of jacket pockets under the tables, and I understood that whatever happened in this barn for the rest of the night, it wasn't staying in this barn. Travis stood beside Heather with his hand hovering near her back, not quite touching her, his face doing the particular kind of stunned that comes from realizing the woman you just married has been carrying something she never told you either. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for the first time all night, my sister, who has never once in her life been at a loss for the right performance, didn't have one ready. I set the phone down on the table, face up, screen still glowing with the state seal in the corner, because I didn't need to hold it anymore. It had already done what it needed to do. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell you I did. What I felt was the particular quiet that comes after you set down something heavy you've been carrying alone for months. A quiet with no applause in it, just the sound of a room finally hearing the truth at the same volume it had heard the lie. Kurt didn't sit back down. He stood there with one hand still braced on the chair, waiting, and when I looked at him, he asked the only question that actually mattered to him. "When do I get the letter?" "By Monday," I said. "The law gives them 5 business days from the notice date to mail it. That's the 20th. If you don't have it by then, call the division yourself. I can give you the number." "I don't need the number," he said. "I've had your grandmother's number in my address book for 30 years. I'll find whoever I need to find." His voice was steady, but his hand on the chair back wasn't, and I watched him lower himself down into his seat like the standing had cost him something. Lori would have hated that. She hated watching him carry his own coat. A woman 2 tables over, someone I half recognized from the office lobby, the kind of face you've seen behind a coffee cup in a waiting area but never gotten a name for, half rose out of her seat too. Is my account on that list? I'm with Norris. I've been with Norris 11 years. I don't have the full list memorized past the 7 I found, I told her, because that was true, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make the room feel finished. If you're not sure, call the office Monday and ask them directly whether your account is named in the notice. They're required to tell you if you ask. She didn't sit back down right away. She just stood there holding the question in her hands like it had weight, and around her I watched 3 more phones come out, not for photographs, just for texting. Thumbs moving fast under the table, edges the way people text when they don't want to be seen doing it. Somebody's advisor, somebody's spouse, somebody's own kid who worked in finance and would know what a notice of examination actually meant. I understood, watching it happen, that this wasn't a rumor anymore. A rumor moves table to table on its own legs. This was moving because people were pushing it themselves, deliberately, toward whoever they trusted to tell them the truth about their own money. The wedding coordinator, a woman in a headset I hadn't paid attention to all night, came around the side of the dance floor with the particular brisk calm of someone paid to keep a night from falling apart. She leaned toward the band leader and said something short, and a few bars of something soft and forgettable started up again, an attempt to paper over the silence with a cello line nobody was going to dance to. Nobody moved toward the floor. The music just sat there in the room, unclaimed. My father stood up. He did it slowly, both hands flat on the table first, pushing himself up the way he does at the end of long client meetings. And for a second, I thought he was finally going to say something to the room, something with weight, an answer instead of a silence. Instead, he lifted both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a man asking a room to settle down. "Folks," he said, "let's not do this here. Whatever's going on, it's a business matter. It belongs in a business conversation, not at my daughter's wedding." It became a business matter for this room the moment Heather stood up with a microphone and told everyone I'd been fired. I said. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I never do. "You had 5 days, Dad." "The notice came to the office on Monday. You knew before any of us. You could have called me. You could have called Heather. You chose to get through the wedding first and hope it held together long enough." He didn't deny it. I watched him not deny it. Watch the muscles along his jaw hold very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math about how much of the truth is already loose in the room and how much might still be contained. It was the same stillness from a minute earlier, except now my mother was looking straight at him instead of at me. Dennis. Just his name, first, flat, the way you set something down on a counter before you ask about it. "Did you know?" He looked at her. He didn't answer. That was the second silence of the night that told me more than words would have, and I watched it land on my mother the way the first one had landed on me weeks earlier at that dinner table when she told me not to ruin the wedding. Except this time there was no wedding left to protect, not one that hadn't already become something else in front of 120 witnesses, and so she didn't have anywhere to put the question except straight at him, in front of all of them. "You knew," she said. Not a question this time. "You knew before the ceremony. You stood up there and gave a toast." "Paula," he said low, like her name alone might get her to lower her voice the way his hadn't gotten the room to lower theirs. "Not now." "You let our daughter get married under this," she said, and her voice cracked once, right in the middle of the sentence, not from crying, from something closer to disbelief finally catching up to itself after being asked, politely, for months, not to look too closely at anything. Heather hadn't moved from where she stood near the head table. She still had the champagne glass in her hand, forgotten now, tipped slightly so a thin line of it ran down over her knuckles, and she didn't seem to notice. Travis had his hand on her back for real now, not hovering, and he was saying something to her quietly that I couldn't hear, and whatever it was, her face didn't change while he said it. She was looking at our father. Dad. Just that. Waiting for him to fix it. The way she'd always waited for him to fix things. The way the whole family had built itself around the idea that he could smooth over anything with the right tone and enough time. He didn't have either one left tonight. "We'll talk about this tomorrow," he said, to her, to my mother, to the room in general, a sentence built to end a conversation rather than answer one. "People don't get their letters tomorrow, Dad," I said. "They get them Monday. This doesn't wait for a good time." The coordinator had drifted closer again, headset hand pressed to her ear, clearly getting instructions from someone, maybe the venue, maybe Travis's family, about how to manage a room this far off its rails. She caught my father's eye and tipped her head toward a side door near the back of the barn, the kind of door that leads to a gravel lot and a row of parked cars, and away from 120 people who'd stopped pretending to eat. "Let's step outside," my father said, to the four of us, to me and my mother and Heather, in the voice he uses when he wants something to look like his idea. Travis started to follow, and Heather put a hand flat on his chest, not pushing him away, just asking him with her palm to stay where he was for one more minute. Like even now, some part of her didn't want him inside, whatever was about to happen next. I looked at my phone one more time before I stood. Cassandra's email was still open on the screen, the state seal still sitting there in the corner of the second page, plain and gray and entirely unconcerned with what it had just done to a wedding. I put the phone in my clutch and I stood up from the table, and I felt the eyes of the room on my back the whole way to that side door, not unkindly, mostly just stunned, the way people watch weather they didn't see coming. The gravel lot was cold in the way Bend gets cold at night, even in July. The heat of the day gone out of the air fast once the sun's behind the ridge. String lights ran along the fence line toward the parking area, swaying a little in a wind I hadn't noticed inside. My father walked a few steps out from the door and stopped under one of them, and turned around to face the three of us, and for a moment none of us said anything at all. Just stood there in a loose half circle on the gravel, dressed for a celebration that wasn't happening anymore. I stood there in the cold with my clutch against my ribs, and for a second nobody moved to fill the quiet my father had opened up by walking us out here. Heather broke it first. She turned on me, not on him, her makeup starting to go soft at the eyes even though she still hadn't actually cried. "You couldn't wait," she said. "You couldn't just let me have one day, Megan. One." "I filed that referral on the 6th of July, I said again, quietly, because she needed to hear it a second time in a smaller space than the barn. 12 days before your wedding. I wasn't thinking about your wedding when I did it. I was thinking about Kurt. You've been thinking about Kurt Adkins more than you've been thinking about your own sister," she said. And there was real hurt under the anger now, not performance. And for a second, I almost felt something for her. "I've been thinking about 7 people who trusted this family with their retirement," I said. You made it about the wedding tonight. Not me. I didn't stand up with a microphone. She flinched like I'd touched a bruise, because we both knew that was true, and she didn't have an answer for it, so she turned to our father instead, the way she'd turned to him 100 times growing up when a fight got too heavy to carry alone. Dad, tell her she's wrong. He didn't. He stood under the string lights with his tuxedo jacket open and his hands loose at his sides, and I watched him look at the gravel instead of at any of us, and the silence stretched long enough that even Heather understood what it meant. Dad. Her voice cracked on the second try. I knew about the notice, he said finally, to the ground, not to her. I found out Monday morning. Our compliance attorney called me before I'd even had coffee. And you said nothing, Paula said. She'd found her voice again, low and even, the kind of even that scares me more than shouting ever has, because I've heard that tone from her exactly twice in my life, and both times something in our family broke afterward, for 5 days. You let me plan a seating chart. You gave a toast about how proud you were. I was going to deal with it after, he said. Monday. I told Megan that in there. I was going to sit down with the attorney Monday and figure out how bad it actually was before I said anything to anybody. You knew how bad it was, I said. You've known for 18 months. You didn't need Monday to tell you that. His head came up at that, fast, and for 1 second I saw something in his face I hadn't seen the whole time I was growing up in that house. Not defensiveness, not the practiced calm he uses on nervous clients. It was closer to fear. The plain kind, the kind that doesn't have a business voice to hide behind. You don't know what you think you know, he said, but it came out thin, the same way Heather's had inside, a man reaching for a line that used to work and finding it didn't have any weight left in it. I know 7 account numbers, I said. I know an authorization form with an altered date. I know Shelby Romero quit over what you asked her to backdate before I ever pulled a single ledger. I know all of it, Dad, because Grandma taught me how to read this stuff before I could drive a car, and you never once thought that mattered. Paula made a small sound, not quite a word, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Heather turned toward her mother like she wanted to go stand next to her, and stopped halfway, like she wasn't sure anymore which side of this gravel lot she belonged on. Shelby, Dennis said. And something in the way he said her name told me he remembered exactly who she was, exactly what he'd asked of her. No confusion at all. Shelby left because she wanted more money. That's what she told me. She told me something different, I said, and her account matches the paperwork. Yours doesn't. He didn't argue that one either. He just stood there with the string lights swaying behind him, and I watched a man who had spent 40 years being the calm voice in every room he walked into discover that calm doesn't work on a piece of paper with a state seal on it. So what happens now? Heather said. Her voice had gone very small. She still had that thin line of spilled champagne drying on her knuckles, and she looked down at it like she was noticing it for the first time and wiped it off against her dress without seeming to think about it. The examination proceeds, I said. The office is already operating under restrictions on those 7 accounts. Letters go out by Monday to everyone named. After that, it's not up to any of us. It's up to the division. And you, she said. What happens to you? You work for the firm that reported us. You realize how that looks. Cascade walled me off the second I brought it to them, I said. I don't touch the review, if there is one. I told them that myself before I filed anything because I wanted it done right, not done by me. Done right, she repeated, and there was a bitterness in it now that had nothing left of the bride from an hour ago. You've been sitting on this for months, building a file, while I was picking out flowers. I raised it at a family dinner in June, I said. Mom told me not to ruin your wedding. Dad changed the subject. I didn't sit on it because I wanted to, Heather. I sat on it because nobody in this family would let me say it out loud until I said it to someone whose job it was to listen. Paula's head turned toward me at that, and for a second her face wasn't angry at anyone. It was just old, older than I'd ever seen it. like the last hour had taken something out of her that wasn't coming back by morning. "I told you not to ruin the wedding," she said, quiet, almost to herself. "I said that." "You did," I said, not unkindly. I wasn't trying to punish her with it. It was just true, and true things don't need much dressing up to land. Somewhere back toward the barn, the side door opened and closed, and Travis came across the gravel with his jacket off, his sleeves rolled, moving fast in a way that told me the room behind him hadn't settled at all. He stopped a few feet short of Heather and looked at her, not at the rest of us, like the four of us out here were background noise, and she was the only signal he could still track. "They're calling cars," he said. "Half the tables. I don't know what to tell your grandmother's friend, the one who stood up. He's asking the coordinator for the venue's landline so he can call the division tonight instead of waiting." "That's Kurt," I said. "He'll want to talk to Julie O'Brien directly. That's the compliance officer handling this. Give him the general division line if he asks you again. I don't have Julie's direct extension memorized." Travis looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time all night, not as the sister who'd caused a scene, but as the only person out here who seemed to know exactly what was happening and exactly what came next. "Is it true?" he asked me directly, quiet enough that it was almost just for me. "All of it. Every account number on that notice is one I found myself," I said. I didn't guess. I checked it against my grandmother's old ledgers first before I ever filed anything, because I didn't want to be wrong about a single dollar. He nodded slowly and didn't look at Heather when he did it, which told her something too, I think, because her shoulders came down an inch, some last hope going out of her that he might simply refuse to believe any of it. "I need to go back in," he said finally. "Somebody has to say something to the room, even if it's just that the night's over." Heather didn't move to go with him right away. She stood there in her dress with the string lights swaying behind her, looking at our father, waiting, I think, for him to finally be the man who fixed things, one more time, the way he always had been for her. He didn't move either. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, looking like a man doing sums he already knew the answer to and didn't like. I turned toward the parking area, past the last row of string lights, to where my car sat quiet at the edge of the gravel with the ridge dark behind it. There wasn't anything left to say out here that the notice hadn't already said better than I could. I found my keys in my clutch, and behind me I heard my mother's voice, low, asking my father one more time whether he'd known, and I heard him not answer her a second time, and I kept walking, because that conversation belonged to the two of them now, not to me. I found my keys in my clutch, and behind me I heard my mother's voice, low, asking my father one more time whether he'd known, and I heard him not answer her a second time, and I kept walking, because that conversation belonged to the two of them now, not to me. I didn't make it to the car. "Megan," Kurt Adkins' voice, from the doorway I'd just come through, and I turned to find him standing there in his good gray suit with his cane in one hand and a folded cocktail napkin in the other, like he'd grabbed it off a table on his way out without thinking about why. He came across the gravel slower than everyone else moved that night, careful about his footing in the dark, and I waited for him instead of meeting him halfway, because some part of me wanted to see how steady he was on his own. "You shouldn't be out here in this cold," I said, "not in dress shoes. I've buried a wife and outlived 2 doctors who told me I wouldn't see 70, he said. "I think I can manage a parking lot." He stopped a few feet from me and looked back toward the barn, where the light spilled yellow out the open doors, and the noise inside had dropped to something low and confused, more murmur than music. "That coordinator gave me a number. For the state office. The division's general line," I said. "They'll route you to someone in examinations. Ask for anyone working the Norris Wealth Advisors file. Tell them you're a named client, and they'll walk you through what happens next. You don't need to call tonight. It'll keep till Monday." "I know it'll keep," he said. "I'm 79 years old, Megan. Things keep for me whether I want them to or not." He turned the napkin over in his hand, and I saw he'd written something on it in pen. blocky and careful the way men his age write when they don't trust a phone to hold a thought. I wrote your grandmother's name on this before I came out here. I don't know why. Felt like she should be part of tonight somehow, and she wasn't, except she was the whole reason any of this got looked at. I didn't say anything to that right away. The wind moved through the string lights again, and somewhere behind us in the barn, a chair scraped hard against the floor, and neither of us turned to look. She'd have caught it faster than I did, I said finally. She kept everything by hand for 38 years because she didn't trust anything she couldn't hold. I used to think that was old-fashioned. Turned out it was the only reason I had anything to check your statement against. She used to tell me that a ledger doesn't lie, even when the person keeping it wants it to, Kurt said. I didn't think much of it at the time. Sounded like something you say to make bookkeeping sound important. He looked at me steady, the same look he'd had across my parents' dinner table back in April, mild and unbothered, like nothing that had happened tonight was going to be the thing that finally rattled him. Turns out she meant it exactly. She did. How much? He said. You don't have to give me numbers if you can't. I know how these things work, confidentiality and all that. I just want to know if it's just me or if there's others. I thought about how much I could say standing in a gravel lot with half the guest list still inside deciding whether to leave. There are others, I said. You're not the only one, Kurt. I can't give you a count tonight. You'll get a letter. Everyone named gets one, and it'll have everything you're entitled to know in it. He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he expected, and folded the napkin back over on itself and tucked it into his breast pocket instead of throwing it away, which struck me as a strange thing to keep, except I understood it. Some nights you want a piece of paper in your pocket that proves you were there when something true finally got said out loud. Your father's going to have a hard few months, he said. I've known Dennis since he was younger than you are now. Watched him grow up in that office, same as I watched Lori keep the books in it. He wasn't asking me to feel sorry for that. He said it the way you'd note the weather. Doesn't change what he let happen. Just means I'm not surprised it hurts you, too, whatever you think you're allowed to feel about it tonight. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, I said, but I'm not going to pretend I could have let it keep going either. Those were your accounts, Kurt. Yours and 6 other people's who trusted this family with money they can't afford to lose twice. I know that. He shifted his weight off the cane, resettling it, and for a second, the porch light behind him caught the side of his face, and I saw how tired he looked, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I just want you to hear it from somebody in there instead of a letter first. Thank you. Whatever it cost you to bring this to somebody, whatever it's going to keep costing you the next few months with your family, it was the right thing. Lori would have told you the same, and she wasn't a woman who handed out that particular sentence easy. I felt something move behind my ribs that I didn't have a name ready for. Not grief exactly, not relief either. Something in between the two that didn't have anywhere to go except into being quiet for a second and letting him see it land. Thank you for saying that, I said. Go home, Kurt. Let somebody drive you. It's cold and you've had a long night. So have you, he said, and there was something almost gentle in it. The way you'd say it to somebody you'd watched grow up, even though he'd only really known me as a girl who used to sit under a desk at that office doing homework while her grandmother closed out a day's entries. He turned, slow and careful again, cane finding the gravel, and made his way back toward the barn where someone, maybe the coordinator, was already holding the door for him and calling toward the parking area for whoever had driven him in. I stood there another moment by myself. The barn glowed behind the tree line, quieter now than it had been an hour ago. Guests trickling out toward the gravel in 2s and 3s, valets jogging between cars with keys jangling in their fists, nobody quite looking at anybody else the way you don't look at people after you've all watched the same accident happen from different seats. My phone buzzed once in my clutch, and I almost didn't check it, and then I did, because some habits don't turn off just because the night has already given you everything it was going to give you. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize with a Bend area code, 3 words and a name I did recognize. An elderly client named, on the list I'd built back in early July, someone I had never spoken to directly. Is this true? Word had already crossed the room faster than any letter was going to move on Monday. I didn't answer it. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because it wasn't mine to answer from a phone in a parking lot at 11 at night. That was what Monday's letters were for, addressed and formal and correct. The kind of correction that doesn't come with anyone's tone attached to it. Just the facts sitting flat on a page, the way Cassandra's email had sat flat in my hand an hour ago. I got in my car and sat for a second before I started it, keys in my lap, looking back through the windshield at the barn lit up gold against the dark tree line, string lights swaying along the fence, the whole scene looking, from this far away, exactly like what it was supposed to look like tonight. A wedding. Nobody driving past on the county road would have known from this distance that anything in there had gone sideways at all. I started the engine. The dash lit up and Cassandra's email was still sitting open on my phone where I'd left it on the passenger seat, the state seal small and gray in the corner of the second page, and I picked it up once more before I pulled out, just to read the subject line again, plain and procedural, nothing dramatic about it at all. That was the thing nobody tells you about the moment a lie finally comes apart. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there in an inbox, addressed correctly, attached properly, waiting for whoever needs to read it to finally open the file. I put the phone face down on the seat and pulled out of the gravel lot, past the ranch gate with its wagon wheel bolted to the post, out onto the county road where the Deschutes ran dark and fast somewhere off to my right, and I drove back toward town without the radio on, because I wanted to hear my own thoughts for once, instead of somebody else's version of what tonight was supposed to mean. I didn't turn the radio on the whole drive back into town, and by the time I pulled into my own parking spot outside the condo, my hands had finally stopped feeling like they belonged to somebody else. I sat there a minute, with the engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the dark windows of my own place, and I thought about how strange it was that nothing about my apartment had changed in the last 3 hours, while everything about my family had. Inside, I didn't turn on the overhead light. I went straight to the closet and pulled down the box. It still had the same masonite lid, the same faded label in my grandmother's handwriting, Adkins K in blue ink gone soft at the edges. I hadn't moved it in 3 years except to slide it aside for a winter coat. I sat down on the floor with my back against the bed frame and opened it, even though I'd already memorized every page inside it months ago, because some nights you don't open a box to learn something new. You open it to remember why you started. I found the page again, her handwriting cramped into the margin from some April 30 years ago. A note about a client's withdrawal that didn't match what he'd told her he wanted, and next to it, in the same pen, a date she'd circled twice. She never explained the circle to anybody. She just kept circling things until somebody asked her why, and I don't think anybody ever had, until me, decades later, sitting on a bedroom floor in a dress I still hadn't changed out of. My grandmother used to say a ledger doesn't lie even when the person keeping it wants it to. Kurt had said the same words to me tonight in a gravel parking lot, and hearing it twice in one day, once from him and once from her handwriting in my lap, I understood something I hadn't quite let myself say out loud before. A ledger is just a kind of memory that refuses to be argued with. It sits there, patient, waiting for the day somebody finally checks it against what they were told. Truth is the slowest receipt there is. It doesn't need you to believe it, it just needs you to wait long enough to read it. I put the lid back on the box before I let myself cry over her, and then I didn't. Not really. Not the way I might have a year ago. I just sat with it a while, and then I got up and put the box back on the closet shelf because I wasn't ready yet to put it anywhere else. Monday morning, I was at my desk at Cascade by 8, and Cassandra Phillips found me there before 9, closing my office door behind her the way she did when she wanted a conversation to stay inside 4 walls. "I read about your weekend," she said, and there was something careful in how she said it. Not unkind, just measured, the way you'd handle a folder you weren't sure yet if you were allowed to open. The email went out exactly the way policy requires it to. I want you to hear that from me directly. Nothing about it was a favor to you. "I know," I said. I wasn't expecting one. "The wall holds," she said. "You're still off the file, full stop. If the division needs an independent reviewer, it won't be you and it won't be anybody who reports to you, and I've already put that in writing to Julie O'Brien this morning, so there's no question about it later." She sat down across from me, and for a second she looked less like my boss and more like a woman who'd spent a long weekend thinking about how this was going to look in a year. "You did this the right way, Megan. I need you to understand that matters more than anything that happened at that reception. You filed first. You let the process work before you ever said a word to your own family about what you'd found." "I said something to my family in June," I said. "Nobody wanted to hear it." "That's not on you," she said. "That was never going to be on you." She stood, smoothing her jacket, already halfway back to the door in her head. "The letters go out to the 7 named accounts by Friday. That's the legal deadline, and the division doesn't extend it for anybody's calendar, wedding, or otherwise. After that, whatever happens with your family is going to happen in public, whether any of us want it to or not." She was right about that. By Wednesday, the local business paper had picked up 2 paragraphs about a Bend wealth management firm operating under a state examination. No names of clients, nothing about a wedding, just the flat fact of it sitting in print the way facts do when nobody's left to argue with them anymore. I read it once at my desk and didn't read it again. I didn't need to. I already knew everything in it better than the reporter did. My phone had been quiet most of the week, which felt like its own kind of answer. Heather hadn't called. I hadn't expected her to. Some silences aren't absence. They're just 2 people finally out of things to say to each other that wouldn't make it worse. Thursday afternoon, sitting in my car in the Cascade parking garage before I drove home, I finally looked at the string of missed calls I'd been letting collect all week without checking who they were from. 2 from a Ben number I still didn't recognize. Probably another named client who'd gotten my name from somewhere in that reception crowd and gone looking. 1 from Kurt, no voicemail, just a call that rang out, and I made a note to call him back myself before the weekend, because a man who wrote my grandmother's name on a cocktail napkin deserved better than a callback he had to chase. And 1 from my mother. No voicemail from her either, just her name sitting there on the screen. Paula, time-stamped Tuesday night. 2 days after the reception, like she'd tried once and lost her nerve before it connected. Or maybe she'd let it ring through on purpose, wanting the missed call itself to say something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I looked at it a long moment, thumb over the screen, not calling back yet. Whatever she wanted to say, it wasn't going to be the kind of thing you said, standing in a garage at the end of a long week. And it wasn't going to be the kind of thing I was ready to hear, standing in one either. Some conversations need a kitchen table. Some need you to have slept on it first, more than once. I put the phone in the cup holder, face down, and drove home, and told myself I'd call her back when I had somewhere quiet enough to actually listen. I called her back on Sunday, 4 days after Cassandra's email had gone out and landed the way it landed. I didn't call from the parking garage. I waited until I was home, sitting at my own kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold in front of me, because I'd decided somewhere in the last few days that if my mother was finally going to say something real to me, I wasn't going to hear it standing up. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up," she said when I did. "I almost didn't," I said. That was the truth, and I'd stopped seeing the point in giving her anything but the truth, plain the way I'd have given it to a client. "Can I come by?" she said. "Not to talk you out of anything. I already know there's nothing left to talk you out of. I just want to sit across from you somewhere that isn't your father's house or a barn full of people I used to think I knew." I told her yes, and I told her Tuesday, and I told her my place, because I wasn't ready yet to sit in the kitchen where I grew up, the one with the calendar on the wall that still probably had Heather's wedding circled in red from back before any of this. She showed up Tuesday evening in a coat she didn't need for the weather, the kind of coat you put on when you want something between yourself and the world for a few extra minutes while you get your nerve up. I made 2 cups of tea neither of us drank much of. She sat where Kurt might have sat if Kurt had ever come to my apartment instead of a gravel parking lot outside a wedding, and she didn't say anything for a while, just turned the mug slowly on the table in front of her. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive your father," she said finally. I don't think that's mine to ask for. I'm not even sure I've forgiven him yet myself, and I've had longer to sit with it than you have." "Okay," I said. "I knew things were tight at the office," she said. "I knew that for a couple of years now. I told myself it was the market. I told myself it was the cost of the new lease or the wedding or 100 small things that add up the way small things always do in a business like ours. I never once asked to see the numbers myself. That was easier. I want you to know I understand now that it was easier because I chose for it to be easier, not because nobody could have shown me. I didn't say anything to that. I let it sit there in the room the way she'd let it sit unspoken for however many years it had actually been true. When you told us in June," she said, "about the account, about Kurt, I told you not to ruin your sister's wedding. I've thought about that sentence more than I've thought about almost anything else in my whole life this last week. I said ruin like the wedding was the thing that mattered most in that room, not Kurt, not whatever you'd found, the wedding." She looked up at me then, and her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying either, not really, just carrying something heavy behind her face that she was trying to set down carefully instead of dropping it. "I'm sorry for that. I don't expect it to undo anything. I just needed you to hear me say it out loud, to your face, once, instead of leaving it as a thing I only felt bad about privately." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, even though thank you didn't feel like nearly enough weight for what she'd just handed me. "I'm not going to pretend everything's fine, Mom. It isn't. Dad's going to have to answer for what he let happen, and that's going to take a long time. And it's not going to be easy for any of us to watch, you included." "I know," she said. "And I don't know what happens with Heather," I said. "I don't know if she calls me or if she doesn't, or if this is just how it is between us now. I'm not going to chase that down and fix it just because it would be tidier for you if I did. I'm not asking you to," she said. "I stopped believing tidy was a thing that was owed to anybody in this family about a week ago. We sat a while longer after that, not saying much, and when she left, she hugged me at the door, briefly, the kind of hug that isn't trying to prove anything, just marking that it happened." I stood in the doorway and watched her walk down to her car under the parking lot lights, coat still buttoned all the way up even though the evening had gone mild, and I thought that whatever came next between us, at least this part of it had been said honestly, out loud, at a kitchen table, instead of left to rot quietly the way so much in that family had been left to rot for so long. The examination ran its course over the weeks that followed, the way those things do, slow and procedural and almost boring on paper, which I'd learned by then was usually a good sign rather than a bad one. Julie O'Brien's office issued its findings in stages, and my father's name showed up in the second one, not as a headline, just as a line item, a principal who authorized transfers he was required to disclose and didn't. No handcuffs, no courtroom scene with anybody standing up dramatically. Just a supervision order and a compliance monitor assigned to the office on Minnesota Avenue for the length of time the division decided was necessary, and 7 letters that had already gone out the Friday after the reception, each one addressed correctly, each one telling 7 people exactly what they were entitled to know. Heather kept her job title for a while, technically, though from what I heard through channels that weren't hers to control anymore, most of her actual client contact had been quietly rerouted somewhere she couldn't touch it. She married Travis under the weight of all of it, a marriage that started with a compliance monitor's business card sitting in a drawer somewhere in their new house instead of a honeymoon album on the counter. I didn't hear from her. I hadn't expected to, and if I'm honest, some nights I still caught myself rehearsing what I'd say if she ever called, the way you keep a spare umbrella by the door even after the season's mostly passed. It was late August by the time I finally moved Lori's box out of my condo closet for good. I brought it into my office at Cascade on a Thursday afternoon, set it up on the shelf behind my desk, where anybody who came in to talk to me would see it, and I didn't explain it to anyone, because it didn't need explaining to anyone who understood what a ledger was actually for. A few weeks after that, one of the junior analysts on my team, a kid barely 2 years out of school who still typed too fast and trusted spreadsheets a little too much, came in with a reconciliation that didn't sit right and couldn't say exactly why. I pulled the lid off the box and showed her one of Lori's old pages, the cramped handwriting, the circled date with no note beside it explaining what it meant. She never wrote down why she circled things, I told her. She just circled them and waited for somebody to ask. That's the whole trick. You don't have to know what's wrong the moment you see it. You just have to mark it and keep looking until the pattern tells you. The girl looked at that faded ink a long moment, the way I once had at a kitchen table decades ago that doesn't exist for me the same way anymore. And she nodded like something had clicked into place that a textbook never quite manages to teach. I keep the box there still, on the shelf behind my desk, not as a memorial and not as a trophy either, just as a tool, the way my grandmother would have wanted it used, because she never once kept those ledgers to prove a point. She kept them so that whenever somebody finally needed the truth written down somewhere nobody could argue with, it would already be there, patient, waiting. A lie only survives as long as nobody checks the math behind it. Mine did the checking, quietly, for months, long before anyone in that barn ever knew my name was attached to anything. And when the moment finally came, it wasn't a shout that ended it. It was an email sitting flat and correct in an inbox, doing exactly what it was built to do. If you've ever been the quiet one in a room that only had eyes for somebody else, if you've ever kept your own receipts because you learned the hard way that nobody else was going to keep them for you, I want to hear where you're listening from tonight, what city, what time it is where you are right now. Type it below and tell me who taught you to notice what everybody else walked past. And if this story found you at the right moment, if some part of it felt like it was written for the version of you that's still waiting for the truth to catch up, hit subscribe before you go. There's more where this came from, and I'd rather tell it to somebody who's already listening.